In the quiet town of Henrietta, Oklahoma, a seemingly ordinary weekend unfolded. Two teenage girls, Ivy Webster and Brittany Brewer, eagerly joined their friend Tiffany Guess for a sleepover at her family's home. The McFadden residence, nestled in a rural area, was a place where laughter and youthful chatter often filled the air. Parents, trusting and unaware, believed their children were safe, spending time with friends under the watchful eye of adults. But as the sun rose on May 1, 2023, a chilling silence replaced the expected morning bustle. Calls to the children went unanswered, and concern began to seep into the hearts of waiting families. The unthinkable had happened. 7 lives had been brutally extinguished, leaving a community in shock and mourning. This is the story of the Henrietta murders, a tragic event that shattered the peace of a small town and left lingering questions about trust, safety, and the hidden dangers that can lurk behind familiar faces. Join us as we delve into the details of that fateful night, seeking to understand how such a catastrophe could occur and what lessons can be learned to prevent future tragedies. Henrietta, a small and unassuming town in Oklahoma, lies nestled among rolling hills and sprawling farmlands. Its quiet streets and friendly atmosphere have long been the hallmark of a tight-knit community where neighbors wave from their porches and everyone knows one another by name. The town prides itself on its simplicity, a place where life moves at a slower, more comfortable pace. Children here grow up riding their bikes down tree-lined streets, their laughter mingling with the chirping of cicadas on warm summer evenings. Weekends are spent at local football games, church gatherings, and potlucks, with families coming together to celebrate their shared history and traditions. Henrietta is the kind of town where locks on doors seem more like formalities than necessities, where trust is ingrained in the very fabric of life. In this seemingly idyllic backdrop, the McFadden family home stood on the outskirts of town. Surrounded by dense woods and open fields, the property was secluded yet inviting. From the outside, it appeared ordinary, just another rural house in a community filled with them. But for those who knew the McFaddens, it was a place where children gathered, where laughter echoed, and where parents felt comfortable sending their kids for playdates and sleepovers. On April 29, 2023, Ivy Webster and Brittany Brewer arrived at the McFadden residence for what they believed would be a weekend of fun and friendship. It was a typical gathering, the kind parents in Henrietta rarely gave a second thought. The girls were excited to join their friend Tiffany Guess, whose family was well known in the community. There was no reason to suspect that this weekend would be any different from countless others, but behind the charm of Henrietta's close-knit community lay a truth that no one could have anticipated. Beneath the surface of trust and familiarity, a storm was quietly building, one that would leave this peaceful town forever scarred. The setting was perfect for a tragedy that no one saw coming. Let's take a moment to meet the lives behind the headlines, to remember the faces and stories of those whose light was stolen that fateful night. Holly Guess, 35, was a devoted mother. Known for her kindness and resilience, Holly had worked tirelessly to create a stable life for her family. Her world revolved around her children, Riley, Michael, and Tiffany, her love for them unmistakable in every choice she made. Holly's friends describe her as a fighter, a woman who had endured hardships but always managed to find a way to persevere. Her priority was her children's happiness, and she poured every ounce of herself into making their lives as full and joyful as possible. Riley Elizabeth Allen, 17, was at the cusp of adulthood, a time when dreams feel limitless. Riley was an honor student, deeply passionate about academics and her future. She loved music, often losing herself in melodies that matched her vibrant personality. Friends say Riley was wise beyond her years, a leader among her peers, with a knack for lifting others' spirits. Her laugh was contagious, a sound that could brighten the darkest days. Michael James Mayo, just 15, was a thoughtful and curious soul, always asking questions about the world around him. Michael had a quiet strength, the kind that made him a steady presence in his family, He loved sports, particularly basketball, and spent many afternoons practicing his jump shot, dreaming of someday playing professionally. Despite his reserved demeanor, those close to him knew his heart was as big as his dreams. And Tiffany Dorgues, 13, was a ray of sunshine in every room she entered. Tiffany was the family spark, full of energy and a boundless imagination. She loved art, often seen with a sketchbook in hand, drawing whatever inspired her at the moment. Her friends admired her creativity and her ability to find beauty in the smallest details. Tiffany was the kind of person who could see magic where others saw only the mundane. Joining Tiffany that weekend were her friends, Ivy Webster, 14, and Brittany Brewer, 15. What should have been a night of fun and friendship became their last. Ivy Webster was known for her adventurous spirit. She loved the outdoors and could often be found hiking or exploring the woods near her home. Her family described her as fearless, with a heart full of love for animals and nature. Ivy's zest for life was infectious, drawing people toward her wherever she went. Brittany Brewer was a beacon of hope in her community. She dreamed of one day becoming a veterinarian, a goal she pursued with determination. Recently crowned Miss Henrietta, Brittany's charm and charisma made her a standout among her peers. She had a warmth about her that made everyone feel seen and valued. These were vibrant lives, filled with potential and promise. They weren't just names in a headline or photos on a screen. They were daughters, sons, friends, and siblings. Their dreams, their laughter, and their love are what made them unforgettable to those who knew them. But tragically, that weekend, their voices were silenced forever. Jesse McFadden was a man who lived in the shadows of his past, a past that, for reasons we may never fully understand, remained unknown to many of those around him. To his neighbors in Henrietta, Oklahoma, he was simply a husband and a stepfather, a man who had started a family and was navigating the complexities of life like anyone else. But behind that facade lay a history that would eventually consume him, his family, and two innocent visitors in one catastrophic night. McFadden's criminal record was anything but ordinary. In 2003, at just 19 years old, he was convicted of first-degree rape in Oklahoma. The victim was a 17-year-old girl, and the assault was as brutal as it was life-altering. McFadden was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a punishment that, to some, seemed fitting for the crime. He served 17 of those years, earning his release in 2020. However, even behind bars, McFadden continued to engage in criminal activity. In 2017, while still incarcerated, he was charged with soliciting sexual conduct from a minor using a contraband cell phone. The evidence against him was damning. Text messages to an underage girl that revealed an alarming pattern of manipulation and predation. Yet, the legal system allowed him to delay the reckoning for this new crime. Through repeated continuances, McFadden managed to postpone his trial until May 1, 2023. It was a date that, tragically, he would never live to see. Upon his release in 2020, McFadden appeared to turn over a new leaf, or at least that's how it seemed. He married Holly Guess, a mother of 3, and became a stepfather to her children, Riley Elizabeth Allen, Michael James Mayo, and Tiffany Dorgues. Holly, described by friends and family as loving and devoted, believed in Jesse. Whether she knew the full extent of his past is unclear, but what is certain is that she trusted him enough to build a life with him. To the outside world, they were a blended family, navigating their challenges like anyone else. But McFadden's dark tendencies did not stay buried for long. As his trial date for the 2017 charges approached, the pressures mounted. His dual existence, a family man on the surface and a predator in the shadows, was closing in on him. And as investigators would later uncover, McFadden made a chilling decision: to eliminate anyone who could connect him to his past or unravel the carefully constructed image he had maintained. What drove Jesse McFadden to commit such an unthinkable act? Was it fear of accountability? A pathological need to control the narrative of his life? Or was it something deeper, something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined? These are the questions that continue to haunt the families of his victims, the community of Henrietta, and anyone who learns the details of this tragic case. These were vibrant young lives, full of potential, gathered for what should have been a night of fun and friendship. Ivy Webster, just 14 years old, was known for her warm smile and infectious laugh, the kind of girl who could light up a room with her presence. Brittany Brewer, 15, was a dreamer with big plans for the future, a future tragically cut short. Tiffany Guess, also 15, was a beloved friend and sibling, always ready to lend a hand or share a joke. For these girls, it was meant to be a carefree evening, a chance to escape the routine of everyday life and revel in the simple joy of being young, together and alive. They were excited, trading stories, snacks, and laughter late into the night. To their families, it was a sleepover like any other, one that promised memories and cherished moments, their potential, their dreams, their laughter, all extinguished in one horrifying act. These were lives that mattered, stories that deserved more chapters, futures that should have been filled with endless possibilities. And it is this loss, this irreplaceable absence, that continues to echo through the lives of their loved ones, their community, and all who hear their story. Jesse McFadden's story is one of stark warnings, legal oversights, and tragic consequences. His criminal history was not just a passing shadow, but a glaring red flag that signaled danger that ultimately went unchecked. It begins in 2003, when McFadden, then 19 years old, was convicted of first-degree rape in Oklahoma. His victim, a young woman, endured an unimaginable ordeal, and the case against him was damning. McFadden was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a punishment that, at the time, many believed would ensure the safety of others. For the next 17 years, he remained behind bars, serving time in a system that many now question whether it truly rehabilitated him. But during his incarceration, McFadden's actions suggested that the predatory behavior that defined his past was far from behind him. In 2017, authorities discovered that McFadden had been using a contraband cell phone to communicate with a minor, a 16-year-old girl. The nature of these communications was deeply disturbing, messages soliciting explicit photographs and conversations steeped in manipulation. The investigation also revealed that he was in possession of child pornography, adding another layer of horror to an already grim situation. These new allegations led to additional charges against him, using technology to solicit sexual conduct with a minor and possession of child pornography. Charges like these would have raised alarm bells for most, but they did little to change the trajectory of McFadden's incarceration. Despite the severity of the accusations, his case did not proceed quickly, leaving a significant window of time during which McFadden's behavior continued largely unchecked within the prison system. In October 2020, after serving 17 years of his original 20-year sentence, Jesse McFadden was released. Oklahoma law mandates that certain offenders, including those convicted of rape, must serve 85% of their sentence before being eligible for parole. Having reached that threshold, McFadden walked out of prison a free man. But his release came with troubling circumstances. The additional charges from 2017 were still pending, meaning he was a man with an unresolved legal battle ahead. Yet, there he was, reintegrating into society. Upon his release, McFadden moved to Henrietta, Oklahoma, a rural town known for its tight-knit community and quiet surroundings. He married Holly Guess, a mother of 3 children, Riley Elizabeth Allen, Michael James Mayo, and Tiffany Dorr Guess. To outsiders, it may have seemed like McFadden was settling into a new life, a family life. But those who knew about his past might have wondered, could a man with such a history truly reform? McFadden's pending charges loomed over him, and the day of reckoning was scheduled for May 1, 2023. On that day, he was set to stand trial for the 2017 solicitation charges, a trial that could have seen him sent back to prison. But McFadden's behavior in the days leading up to the trial painted a picture of a man under immense pressure. Court records later revealed that McFadden had reached out to the 16-year-old victim from the 2017 case, sending her chilling messages. He expressed anger and frustration, blaming her for his legal troubles, and, in one message, ominously suggested that his life was over. When May arrived, McFadden failed to appear in court. Alarmed, law enforcement officials issued a bench warrant for his arrest, initiating a chain of events that would uncover the horrifying truth. That same day, on McFadden's property, 7 bodies were discovered. Among them were McFadden himself, his wife Holly, her 3 children, and 2 young girls who had been invited to the home for a sleepover, Ivy Webster and Brittany Brewer. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. People who had interacted with McFadden, including his neighbors and acquaintances, were stunned. How could someone with such a history not only integrate into society, but also carry out an act of such profound violence? The timeline of Jesse McFadden's criminal history raises pressing questions. How could someone convicted of first-degree rape, who later faced charges for soliciting sexual conduct with a minor, be released and allowed to live freely while awaiting trial? How could the system fail so spectacularly to protect the public, especially vulnerable children, from a man with such a clear pattern of predatory behavior? For many, McFadden's case underscores the need for stricter laws and better monitoring of convicted sex offenders. Should someone with an active case involving child exploitation be allowed to roam free? Should there have been more safeguards in place to prevent him from creating an illusion of normalcy, all while harboring dangerous tendencies? The answers to these questions remain as complex as they are haunting. What is clear, however, is that Jesse McFadden's story is not just about one man. It's about a system that allowed him to slip through the cracks. And tragically, it's a story that ended in unimaginable loss for the families of Ivy Webster, Brittany Brewer, Holly Guess, and her 3 children. Ivy Webster and Brittany Brewer were just like any other teenage girls, full of excitement for life and the small joys that punctuated their days. When Tiffany Guess, their close friend, invited them over for a sleepover, it was an instant yes. Sleepovers were a cherished tradition for the trio, a chance to bond over late-night chats, movies, and snacks. For them, the McFadden house felt familiar. It wasn't just a house. It was a place where they'd made memories before. There was no reason to believe this time would be any different. Their parents, like all parents, held the unspoken faith that their children would be safe. They asked the usual questions. Who will be there? What time do we pick you up? Do you have your phone? These were the typical concerns, routine check-ins meant to ensure that the kids would be okay. But in a small town like Henrietta, Oklahoma, a place where neighbors wave to each other in passing and trust feels inherent, their fears were minimal. After all, Tiffany's mom, Holly Guess, would be there. She was known to be warm and caring, always looking out for the kids. On that fateful weekend, Ivy's parents dropped her off at the McFadden residence. The property was rural and somewhat secluded, surrounded by fields and the quiet calm that defines small-town America. Brittany soon joined, her own parents confident she'd be well cared for. Neither family could have imagined the terror that would soon unfold. As they drove away, perhaps waving at Holly or exchanging pleasantries, their thoughts were far from anything ominous. They believed their daughters were in the company of friends, in a home where safety was a given. As the girls settled into the weekend, the usual excitement of a sleepover took over. The sounds of their laughter echoed through the house as they played games, shared jokes, and perhaps whispered about crushes or the latest drama at school. It was the kind of evening every parent pictures when they let their kids spend the night with friends. A space for joy, freedom, and lightheartedness. But behind the laughter and the innocent facade of a sleepover, there was a hidden truth, a shadow hanging over the McFadden household that no one could see. Jesse McFadden, Holly's husband, was a man with a past that would have sent chills down anyone's spine if they'd known the full extent of it. A convicted sex offender, McFadden had been sentenced to 20 years in prison for first-degree rape in 2003. He had served 17 of those years before being released on good behavior in 2020, returning to a world that seemed to have moved on without him. But Jesse McFadden hadn't truly moved on. In 2017, while still behind bars, he was accused of soliciting sexually explicit images from a minor. The charges had been hanging over him ever since, and his trial was finally scheduled for May 1, 2023. This trial loomed large in McFadden's life, a moment that threatened to unravel the carefully constructed illusion of normalcy he had built since his release. Yet, remarkably, he had kept this from almost everyone. Even Holly, his wife, and the children who lived under his roof appeared unaware of the full extent of his legal troubles and past offenses. The lack of transparency extended beyond his household. McFadden's criminal record, while public, wasn't common knowledge in the small town of Henrietta. Parents like Ivy and Brittany's had no way of knowing who he truly was. To them, he was just Holly's husband, a man who had blended into the fabric of the community, quietly avoiding attention or suspicion. The children's presence at the sleepover was a testament to the trust their families placed in the McFadden household. But it was trust tragically misplaced. As the sleepover continued, the girls likely felt at ease, completely unaware of the danger that was present. For Ivy, Brittany, and Tiffany, it was just another night of fun and friendship. Their conversations were probably filled with dreams of the future, plans for summer break, and the carefree musings of teenage life. The adults in their lives assumed they were safe, imagining the girls tucked into sleeping bags or sprawled out on couches, the sounds of their giggles fading into the early hours of the morning. However, the events of that night would soon shatter every expectation, every assumption of safety. Unbeknownst to the children and their parents, Jesse McFadden was harboring plans that no one could have foreseen. The weight of his impending trial and the secrets he had buried were about to come crashing down in a way that would devastate not just the McFadden family, but the entire community. The parents at home perhaps thought of their daughters with fondness that night, wondering if they were having fun, maybe even staying up too late. There was no way they could have anticipated what was happening behind closed doors. For Ivy and Brittany's families, the morning would bring silence instead of answers, worry instead of relief, and a devastating truth that no parent should ever have to face. By the time the sun rose on May 1st, the world they knew would be irreparably changed. What should have been a joyful reunion at the end of the sleepover turned into a waking nightmare. What the authorities would discover in the hours to come would leave a community grappling with questions that still linger. How could this have happened? Could it have been prevented? And who, if anyone, was to blame for the horrific chain of events that claimed the lives of 7 innocent people? On the morning of May 1, 2023, unease began to ripple through 2 families in the close-knit town of Henrietta, Oklahoma. Ivy Webster, 14, and Brittany Brewer, 15, were expected home early that morning after spending the weekend with their friend, 13-year-old Tiffany Guess. It was a plan as routine and harmless as any, a simple sleepover at a trusted friend's house. But as the hours ticked by, what had started as mild concern turned into dread. The parents of Ivy and Brittany began frantically calling their daughters' cell phones. One call after another went straight to voicemail. Texts went unanswered. For parents, these moments of silence can feel eternal. But they reassured themselves with comforting rationalizations. Maybe the girls had fallen asleep late and were still catching up on rest. Maybe they had forgotten to charge their phones or were preoccupied with their teenage lives, laughing, talking, or scrolling through social media. But by mid-morning, hope began to dim. Something wasn't adding up. Brittany's father, who had always trusted her to stay in touch, grew increasingly anxious. Ivy's family, equally worried, decided they couldn't wait any longer and contacted the authorities. Soon after, the Henrietta Police Department issued an Amber Alert for the 2 missing girls. Amber Alerts are a parent's worst nightmare come to life. The piercing alarm that interrupts regular broadcasts, the photos of smiling children juxtaposed with the terrifying unknown of their absence, it all sent a shiver through the community. The message was clear. 2 young lives were at risk. Law enforcement immediately began piecing together the puzzle. Where were the girls last seen? Who were they with? Those questions pointed to one unsettling answer: Jesse McFadden. Jesse McFadden was the stepfather of Tiffany Guess and the host of the sleepover. While many in the community viewed him as an unremarkable figure, McFadden had a dark and well-documented past. He was a registered sex offender, convicted of first-degree rape in 2003, and had spent 17 years behind bars. He was required to register as a sex offender and live under the shadow of constant scrutiny. Yet somehow, he had managed to establish a life that appeared, at least outwardly, normal. This revelation shook the families of Ivy and Brittany to their core. How could they have allowed their daughters to stay under the roof of a man like that? And why hadn't they been warned? But in these critical hours, there was no time for such questions. The focus was on finding the girls, alive. Authorities began the search, narrowing their efforts to McFadden's property, a secluded home set against the rural backdrop of Henrietta. The house sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by overgrown grass and a sense of eerie isolation. It was the kind of place that might easily be overlooked, a quiet corner of the countryside that didn't invite much attention. Deputies arrived on the property, their approach cautious. They knocked on the door, but were met with silence. They called out, hoping for any sign of life, but the stillness remained. What should have been a bustling home, filled with teenagers and a family's morning routine, was eerily quiet. The decision was made to search the grounds. Officers walked the perimeter, scanning the area for anything unusual. The property stretched wide, with patches of tall grass swaying in the breeze. Then, as they ventured further, they found it, a discovery so horrific it would forever change the town of Henrietta. They lay on the property, their lives stolen by the violence of gunfire. Each victim had been shot in the head, a brutal and calculated execution. Among the dead were Ivy Webster and Brittany Brewer, the two young girls whose absence had sparked the search. Their vibrant lives, filled with promise and possibility, had been cut tragically short. Beside them were Holly Guess, Jesse McFadden's wife, and her 3 children: 17-year-old Riley Elizabeth Allen, 15-year-old Michael James Mayo, and 13-year-old Tiffany Guess, the friend who had invited Ivy and Brittany to stay the night. And then there was Jesse McFadden himself, lifeless, with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The man who had orchestrated this unimaginable crime had ended his own life, leaving no opportunity for justice to be served. The scene was devastating, each detail more harrowing than the last. Investigators moved carefully, documenting the crime scene with meticulous precision. The bodies were identified, and the property was scoured for additional evidence, though nothing could undo the horror that had already unfolded. For the families, the news was a crushing blow. Ivy's parents, who had been holding on to hope just hours earlier, were now grappling with the unthinkable. Brittany's father, who had spent the morning praying for a miracle, now faced a reality that no parent should ever have to endure. And for Holly's extended family, the loss was incomprehensible. A mother and her 3 children wiped out in an act of cold, calculated violence. As word of the tragedy spread, the town of Henrietta was overcome with grief. Neighbors and friends struggled to make sense of what had happened. The quiet rural community, unaccustomed to such atrocities, was now the epicenter of a national tragedy. Candlelight vigils were held, tears were shed, and questions were asked, questions that would reverberate far beyond the borders of this small Oklahoma town. What could drive someone to commit such an act? Were there warning signs that had gone unnoticed? And most pressing of all, could this have been prevented? As investigators worked tirelessly to untangle the events of that horrific night, the full scope of the tragedy became heartbreakingly clear. Forensic autopsy reports revealed a truth too devastating for the grieving families to bear. Ivy Webster and Brittany Brewer, vibrant teenagers with their entire lives ahead of them, had been sexually assaulted before their untimely deaths. These findings confirmed that their final hours were not only marred by terror, but also by a brutal violation of their innocence. This revelation shattered the illusion of safety that the McFadden residents had once represented to the victims' families. Ivy and Brittany had been excited for a weekend with their friends, a chance to laugh, bond, and share moments that should have been carefree. Instead, their lives were violently stolen by a man who had already proven himself a danger to society: Jesse McFadden. For the investigators, this was a deeply unsettling moment. McFadden's criminal history, which included a prior conviction for rape and allegations of predatory behavior, painted the picture of a man who had manipulated those around him. It became increasingly clear that his past had not only been a warning, but perhaps an unheeded cry for stricter oversight. How, many wondered, had a man with such a record been allowed the freedom to perpetrate such heinous crimes again? The murder weapon, an unassuming 9mm handgun, provided further insight into the premeditated nature of McFadden's actions. When officers recovered the firearm from the crime scene, its presence was initially puzzling. How had McFadden acquired a weapon given his criminal background? The answer was both startling and tragic. The gun had been legally purchased by Holly Guess, McFadden's wife, over a year earlier, in January 2022. Holly's reasons for purchasing the gun remain unknown. Perhaps she intended it as a means of protection for her family, unaware that it would one day be turned against her and her children. Perhaps it was McFadden himself who influenced her decision to buy it, manipulating her trust in him to serve his own dark purposes. What became undeniable was that the weapon had been used in one of the most horrific crimes the small town of Henrietta had ever seen. Forensic evidence revealed that McFadden had carefully planned the massacre. He had the firearm at his disposal and the trust of his family and the children's parents, who had no reason to suspect him of such monstrous intentions. This calculated betrayal deepened the tragedy, underscoring the extent of his manipulation. The connection between the weapon and McFadden also raised uncomfortable questions. Could Holly have known about the darkness lurking beneath the surface of her husband's outward demeanor? Was she aware of his criminal history or the full extent of his tendencies? If she had known, had she ever felt trapped, unable to speak out or act against him? Or had McFadden so thoroughly concealed his true nature that even those closest to him had been kept in the dark? What became apparent to investigators was that McFadden's actions weren't the result of a sudden fit of rage or impulsive violence. This was a meticulously planned act of destruction. The gun had been in the home for months, perhaps even years. The trust he had cultivated among his victims was deliberate, making his betrayal all the more insidious. McFadden's actions demonstrated a cold, calculated intent to destroy, leaving no one spared, not even himself. But there were even more layers to the horror. The timing of the massacre coincided with a court date McFadden was scheduled to attend on May 1, 2023. This was no ordinary proceeding. He was facing charges related to his solicitation of a minor while serving time for his earlier rape conviction. It was clear that this looming trial had weighed heavily on him, potentially serving as the catalyst for the horrific events that unfolded. Investigators speculated that McFadden had orchestrated the massacre as a twisted attempt to escape accountability, ensuring that his secrets would die with him. The aftermath of these revelations sent shockwaves through the Henrietta community and beyond. Families who had trusted McFadden, parents who had believed their children were spending a safe weekend at a friend's house, were left grappling with guilt, grief, and rage. The legal system, too, came under scrutiny, as questions arose about how a man with McFadden's history had managed to slip through the cracks. In the days and weeks following the tragedy, the story dominated headlines. Advocacy groups called for changes in the monitoring of sex offenders, demanding that more stringent measures be put in place to prevent similar tragedies. For the families of Ivy and Brittany and the other victims, the revelations were a painful reminder of how one man's unchecked evil could devastate so many lives. The ENM handgun, a small and otherwise ordinary object, became a symbol of the events that had unfolded, a chilling reminder of how premeditated violence can lurk in plain sight. Its presence in the home highlighted the tragic irony that even efforts to protect a family could be weaponized by someone with malicious intent. For the grieving parents of Ivy Webster and Brittany Brewer, the knowledge of what their daughters endured before their deaths was an additional burden of unimaginable pain. They had trusted the McFadden household, believing it to be a safe haven for their children. The betrayal of that trust, coupled with the horrifying details that emerged, left scars that would never fully heal. In the end, the disturbing revelations unearthed in the wake of the Henrietta murders served as a grim reminder of the depth of human cruelty. They raised questions about justice, trust, and the ways in which the system had failed to protect the most vulnerable. But for the families of the victims, these revelations were not just a story. They were a reality they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The tragedy that unfolded in Henrietta wasn't just an event. It was an earthquake that left cracks in the very foundation of the town's identity. This was a community where neighbors knew one another by name, where children rode their bikes on quiet streets, and where trust was the unspoken glue binding everyone together. In the wake of the Henrietta murders, that trust was irrevocably shattered, leaving a wound that would take years to heal. Her mother added through tears, "We sent her to a sleepover with friends. How could we have known it would be the last time we'd ever see her smile? The Websters had always been cautious about where their daughter spent her time, but Jesse McFadden had slipped through their radar, as he had for so many others in the community. Brittany Brewer's family faced a similarly devastating reality. Brittany had been a bright, outgoing teenager with aspirations that reached far beyond the small-town limits of Henrietta. Her father, Nathan Brewer, recounted her dreams with a mix of pride and sorrow. Brittany wanted to compete in pageants. She wanted to be a teacher. She had so much to give, so much life left to live, and it was all taken away. Nathan struggled to reconcile his grief with the circumstances of his daughter's death. "We trusted them. We thought she was safe. How do you ever come back from this? How do you ever trust again?" The Guess family's grief was multi-layered and profound. Holly Guess, a loving mother of 3, was known for her tireless dedication to her children: Riley Elizabeth Allen, 17, Michael James Mayo, 15, and Tiffany Dorr Guess, 13. Holly worked hard to provide a stable and loving home for her family, doing everything in her power to give her children a happy childhood. The loss of all 4 in one night was a blow that no words could adequately capture. Holly's extended family spoke out, describing her as a fiercely protective mother who always put her children first. Holly adored her kids. She lived for them. To think that someone she trusted, someone she believed in, could do this to her and her babies. Holly's sister trailed off, overcome with emotion during an interview. Tiffany, the youngest of Holly's children, had invited her friends Ivy and Brittany to what should have been a fun and innocent weekend sleepover. Known for her bubbly personality and love of dance, Tiffany was the life of any gathering. "She was so full of energy," a family friend recalled. "She loved music, loved to laugh. It's impossible to imagine her not being here anymore." The ripple effects of the tragedy extended far beyond the victims' families. The entire town of Henrietta came to a standstill as news of the massacre spread. Parents who had sent their own children to sleepovers at friends' homes began questioning every decision. Schools were inundated with grief counselors as students struggled to process the loss of their classmates and friends. A local pastor described the mood in the town as a collective heartbreak. Vigils were held in honor of the victims, drawing hundreds of residents to the local high school gym and the town square. The gym, usually filled with the sounds of laughter and cheers, was instead silent, except for the quiet sobs of mourners holding candles. At the front of the room, photos of Ivy, Brittany, Tiffany, Riley, Michael, and Holly stood as a poignant reminder of lives cut tragically short. One of the most emotional moments came during a speech by Ivy Webster's mother. Holding back tears, she addressed the crowd. "We trusted the wrong person. We trusted someone who we thought was safe. But this isn't just about us. It's about all of us as parents, as a community. We have to do better. We have to protect our kids." Her words resonated deeply, sparking calls for action. In the days following the tragedy, conversations about systemic failures gained momentum. Community members demanded answers about how Jesse McFadden, a convicted sex offender with a violent history, had been allowed to integrate into their community with such ease. "This isn't just about what happened that night," one neighbor said. "This is about why it was allowed to happen in the first place." The outrage wasn't limited to Henrietta. Advocacy groups across the state of Oklahoma began lobbying for stricter laws and more rigorous monitoring of registered sex offenders. Petitions circulated calling for reforms to prevent individuals with McFadden's criminal background from slipping through the cracks. Meanwhile, the families of the victims channeled their grief into ensuring their loved ones would never be forgotten. Memorials were established in their honor, including scholarships in the names of Ivy, Brittany, and the Guest children. At the local park, trees were planted for each of the victims, their names engraved on plaques at the base. Even as the town tried to move forward, the scars left by the Henrietta murders were impossible to ignore. Parents became more cautious, second-guessing the safety of their children's friends and activities. Schools incorporated new safety measures, while conversations about trust and awareness became a central focus in classrooms and homes alike. Through it all, the families remained united in their determination to remember their loved ones. not as victims, but as individuals who brought light and love into the world. Ivy was more than what happened to her, her mother said. She was kind, funny, compassionate. That's how we'll remember her. That's how the world should remember her. For Brittany's father, Nathan, the loss was a stark reminder of how quickly life can change. You never think it'll happen to you, but it did. And now, all I can do is make sure people know her story. I don't want anyone to forget her. As the candles burned out at the final vigil, the town of Henrietta was left to grapple with the weight of its loss. The memories of Ivy, Brittany, Tiffany, Riley, Michael, and Holly lingered in every corner of the community, a painful but poignant reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of vigilance, trust, and love. The discovery of the Henrietta murders shook not just the town, but the entire nation. The realization that Jesse McFadden, a convicted sex offender, was allowed to live freely with minimal supervision ignited a firestorm of outrage and demands for systemic change. Families of the victims, community leaders, and advocacy groups began asking the difficult but necessary questions. How could this happen? What went wrong in this system that was supposed to protect vulnerable lives? Jesse McFadden's criminal history was no secret. Convicted of first-degree rape in 2003, McFadden served 17 years in prison, but was released in 2020, 3 years short of his full sentence. While in prison, McFadden faced additional charges for using a contraband phone to solicit sexual conduct from a minor. Despite this, he was out on parole and awaiting trial for these charges when the murders occurred. Authorities revealed troubling gaps in the monitoring of McFadden after his release. As a registered sex offender, McFadden was required to adhere to strict reporting conditions, but there appeared to be significant lapses. He moved into a household with children, his stepchildren and their friends, without raising any red flags. Neighbors, unaware of his past, interacted with him as though he were any other member of the community. Parents who sent their children for sleepovers at his home had no idea they were exposing them to a convicted predator. The failures went beyond local law enforcement. Critics pointed to an overwhelmed parole system and inadequate resources for tracking high-risk individuals as contributing factors. Advocacy groups stressed the importance of not only monitoring registered sex offenders more closely, but also ensuring they were barred from environments where they could easily exploit or harm others. The Henrietta murders prompted widespread calls for legislative reform. The families of the victims, alongside advocacy organizations, began campaigning for more stringent oversight of sex offenders. Community leaders and politicians echoed these calls, pledging to ensure no other family would suffer a similar tragedy. Proposals included mandatory electronic monitoring. Advocates argued for GPS ankle monitors to be mandatory for high-risk offenders, ensuring authorities could track their movements at all times. Proactive community notifications. The case exposed gaps in how information about registered sex offenders was shared with the public. Lawmakers suggested enhancements to notification systems, ensuring families and neighbors were aware of potential risks. Increased resources for parole systems. Many pointed to the underfunding of parole departments as a critical issue. With limited staff and overwhelming caseloads, proper oversight was often impossible. Bans on residency near children. Legislators pushed for stricter laws barring sex offenders from living in homes with minors or being in close proximity to schools, playgrounds, or community centers. For the families of Ivy Webster, Brittany Brewer, and the other victims, legislative reform became a deeply personal mission. Brittany Brewer's father, Nathan, spoke publicly about his devastation and his determination to push for stronger protections. "We cannot bring our daughters back, but we can fight to make sure this never happens again," he said at a rally. The tragedy also served as a grim reminder of the consequences of leniency in cases involving repeat offenders. National organizations joined the effort, launching campaigns to reform sex offender registries, parole protocols, and judicial sentencing for sexual predators. Despite the legislative momentum, the case left haunting questions. How many other offenders might slip through the cracks of an overburdened system? Could McFadden's additional trial, which was set for the very day the murders were discovered, have prevented the tragedy if it had occurred sooner? And how does a community begin to heal when trust in the very systems meant to protect them has been so thoroughly eroded? The Henrietta murders were a devastating chapter in Oklahoma's history, but they also became a turning point in the conversation about public safety, justice, and accountability. For the victims' families, justice was no longer about punishment. It was about prevention, ensuring their loved ones' deaths would not be in vain. As reforms began to take shape, the victims' stories lived on, a somber reminder of the urgent need for vigilance and the ongoing battle to protect the innocent. As we remember the innocent lives lost in this unimaginable tragedy, it's impossible not to feel the weight of the questions left behind. Ivy Webster and Brittany Brewer, full of hope and promise, were simply two friends excited for a night of fun. Tiffany Guess and her siblings, Riley and Michael, were children navigating their own paths in life, unaware of the danger that had entered their home. Holly Guess, a devoted mother, had no way of knowing the man she trusted would turn into the source of such unimaginable pain. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not as victims of a cruel act, but as individuals whose lives touched their families, friends, and community in profound ways. Yet, we are left grappling with the harsh reality. This could have been prevented. How can we ensure that such a tragedy never happens again? Is it time to revisit the systems that allow convicted offenders to walk freely among us? Are we failing to provide communities with the tools to identify and address threats before they escalate? The truth is, the answers to these questions lie in collective accountability. Laws can change, monitoring can improve, and awareness can be heightened, but it starts with a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. We must ask, what safeguards are needed to protect the innocent? How do we hold those in power accountable for ensuring these systems work? And most importantly, how do we support the families left shattered by the cracks in these systems? In their memory, we must push forward, not out of fear, but out of a determination to create a safer world. A world where children can go to a sleepover without parents fearing the worst. A world where justice serves its purpose, and no one is left wondering how it all went so horribly wrong. Their names, Tiffany, Ivy, Brittany, Riley, Michael, Polly, deserve more than just to be remembered. They deserve action, and it's up to us to ensure that their story is not just one of sorrow, but of meaningful change. What are your thoughts on the systemic failures that allowed this tragedy to unfold? Could stronger oversight and stricter enforcement have made a difference? Share your insights in the comments below. Let's start a meaningful conversation about how we can prevent such heartbreak in the future. For more in-depth true crime stories and detailed explorations into the cases that shock the world, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Together, we can uncover the stories that need to be told.